Hello and welcome to the 25th episode of Free Speech, the Natural United podcast, where we talk about interesting geopolitical issues that affect the environment and beyond. And today we're going to be addressing one that affects every person on Earth, no matter where you live, and that is agricultural pollution. Now, agricultural practices are obviously different from place to place, so different areas have different environmental problems when it comes to this. But we'll go over some of the basic ones that are important to know and are happening at a large scale. So to kind of start the video off, we'll start with a definition of agricultural pollution, which is a byproduct of farming practices that result in contamination or degradation of the environment. So the main two impacts that this will have on someone's daily life is one, injury or health issues to humans, and then beyond that, there is economic interests of the long term and trying to preserve our earth so that we can continue to farm sustainably for hopefully as long as possible. So there's kind of two areas that this comes from. There's point source pollution, and this is when there is a single identifiable point and it is a source of pollution to either air, water, thermal, noise, or light. And beyond that, there's also non-point source pollution, and this is the diffuse sources where it is land runoff or precipitation or atmospheric deposition or drainage or seepage or hydrological modification, which could be snowmelt or anything related to that nature. And so there are a lot of different causes of where agricultural pollution comes from, but those are kind of the two categories that they're broken down into. And then another two categories that define where the pollution or contamination is coming from is abiotic and biotic. So abiotic meaning physical rather than biological, and it's not derived from living organisms. And then biotic meaning relating and resulting from living things, and this happens especially in ecological relations. And when we break down these two, you'll have a pretty good understanding of how they're very different from one another, but those are kind of the two categories that are given. And when it comes to agricultural pollution, really the biggest thing that we can do is management practices. As farmers, as politicians, as economists, figuring out the practices that we could have where our agricultural practices would be able to continue for thousands of years without problems. So we're going to kind of start this off with talking about all the abiotic sources, meaning the physical rather than biology. So one that you're probably familiar with and is commonly known to be good and bad for farming practices is pesticides and herbicides. Pesticides being to kill insects, and then herbicides to kill weeds and different plants that are bad for crops. So really both of those culminated together. They control pests that could potentially disrupt crop production. So as a result of the use of pesticides and herbicides, we have soil contamination, we have toxicity to soil organisms. Animals honestly eat a lot of contaminated food as a result of them. It can actually poison to pollinators that allow for better growth of plants and different organisms that are being grown by farmers. And then beyond that, it also kills natural enemies of the pests that they're trying to fight in the first place. And then there's also pesticide leaching, which is pesticides mixing with water and then moving through soil, which can actually cause the spread of those chemicals to other areas where they weren't even planted. And then you have fertilizers. Fertilizers, they provide crops with additional, let's say, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or really any nutrient that a particular plant might need to flourish. So when we look at the different chemicals that we are applying to our soil, we have cadmium, which it contaminates soil, plants, and is also limited by the European Commission. And the reason that it is so rampant is because fertilizers are made from phosphate. And when you take phosphate rocks, they contain cadmium. So it's very, very difficult to vet that out of the process. And so the European Commission has seen what is going on in this area of farming, and they've said this is the maximum amount that we will allow. And that's very difficult when you think you're mining phosphate rocks and you're trying to pull as much phosphate as you can so that you can make these fertilizers, but it's difficult to keep the excess materials out of that. And so fluoride is another example of this, where phosphate rocks contain fluoride, and livestock can actually ingest the fluoride and contaminate soil. And so fluoride is very, 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 very toxic to wildlife and microorganisms, and I say it that much because it's actually put in water as a cleaning element, which many people are not okay with, myself included, but you're welcome to your own perspective on how damaging that might be to your body. So beyond that, there's also radioactive elements. The biggest one that comes to mind is uranium-238, which is found in phosphate rocks, and it causes radioactive contamination to food that humans are ingesting, which is terrifying, and why I brought it up in this video. This is something that has been happening for a very long time and will continue to happen until we change our collective management practices. And then you have other metals. They're not as common, but for example, the steel industry, they have different wastes that they repurpose for fertilizers, but oftentimes what will happen is there will be lead or arsenic or nickel that is in the material and will eventually end up in our food in trace amounts. And so beyond that, there is soil erosion and sedimentation. It's the last of the abiotic sources that we will talk about, even though there are many more. And about 6 million hectares are irreversibly damaged every year from sediment accumulation. This is absolutely terrifying. It means that a lot of the land that we're using now, we will not be able to in the future as a result of soil erosion and sedimentation. So all of these put together, it can be very detrimental, our farming practices, to the future farming practices when we have 6 million hectares of land disappearing as a result of our collective farming practices. But now a switch to the biotic sources. So this is kind of the sources of pollution that are resulting from living things. So first, you have greenhouse gases from fecal waste. 18% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases come directly from the world's livestock, which is actually more than transportation. You'd think us driving all these cars, maybe even flying airplanes across the world and across the country would be the largest cause of greenhouse gases, but it is actually the waste from animals. And so if we were to just, let's say, stop eating animals overnight, we would see a 28% decrease in our greenhouse gases, which is incredibly substantial when you consider all that's going on in the world. And then beyond that, you have invasive species. So this causes habitat disturbance, and it can impact the native species, the species that have been there for a very long time and are critical to the pyramid of life in that area. So old world parasites are actually finding new life as a result of this. And if you want an example of the effect of that, it is the declining bee populations that we've seen is in big part as a result of invasive species in the environment. Now, this next one that I'm going to bring up, it is a very, very sensitive topic. Millions of people, if not tens of millions of people, make their money as a result of this practice. And I want to kind of say before I talk about it at all, this is GMOs, genetically modified organisms. If it were not for GMOs, the entire world would starve. That is an objective fact. If you talk to farmers, if you talk to food distributors, they will tell you that the world would starve if GMOs did not exist. So I'm not suggesting the dismantlement of the practice, but kind of the result of our use of GMOs can be increased agricultural pollution. Although it does help feed the world, there are practices within GMOs, there are chemicals within GMOs that make it very difficult for us to continue at the rate that we have been producing food with GMOs. They cause excess pollution, although with the nature of GMOs, we can root out the negative aspects of them. So hopefully hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future, GMOs will be made differently where the negative consequences of using them are a bit less existent. But like I said, don't misinterpret me as saying we should completely abolish GMOs. Like I said, the world would starve without them. We have billions of people, which is a very new thing. There weren't billions of people not that long ago. And so GMOs have been a huge help in feeding the world, but they also have their negative consequences as well. Then the last biotic source that I will talk about in this video is anaerobic digestion in lagoons, which is a biological treatment of liquid animal waste, and it promotes decomposition by basically trapping all the air out of an environment, and is an environmentally superior technology from my perspective that offsets the pollution that we're creating from farming. I think that anaerobic digestion is going to be a huge, huge role player in trying to reduce the effect that humans have in farming and feeding ourselves. So those are just a few of the things that we have to worry about farmers creating in our environment, whether it's the quality of our air, the quality of our water, the quality of our soil. All of these are dependent on the practices of the people who make our food. And for the most part, we have to be grateful in the first place that they're willing to spend their time in this way, because without them we would starve. But beyond that, I think in the years to come, there are going to be a good number of solutions to a lot of the problems that I listed, but they are problems nonetheless. They are contaminating our soil, and as a result of that, I felt like it was worth making this video. If you have any suggestions for what I should talk about in future videos, please leave it in the comments. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and obviously YouTube. So if you would like to learn more about any particular topic, leave it in the comments and I will do my research on it and try to present it as objectively as possible. But beyond that, thank you guys so much for your time. It's been an amazing 25 episodes so far, and I'm going to work to make it 100 as soon as possible. I hope you have an awesome day.